Thank you for tuning back into Conversations with Cabral. This week's special guest is Mark Wolynn. You may have heard about his world-famous book, It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. It was awarded in 2016 the Silver Nautilus Book Award in Psychology, and it's now been translated into 20 different languages around the world. His articles have also appeared in Psychology Today, Mind Body Green, MariaShriver.com, Elephant Journal, and Psych Central, and his poetry has been published in The New Yorker. I want to let you know this, that Mark is one of the foremost experts in being able to help you identify where some of the self-sabotage is coming from, the anxiety, the depression, failed relationships, failed jobs and careers, why those things may be happening to you. If you've been listening to the Cabral concept for some time, you understand and you know that we've worked through the subconscious mind, that we begin to see how our thoughts affect our feelings and our feelings affect our actions, and we create this circle. Well, Mark begins to take this to another level. He shares with us how actually multi-generations, how great-grandparents and grandparents could be affecting us today, and how certain inherited traumas are actually imprinted on our DNA, or more specifically, how it's imprinted on our messenger RNA, and it gets handed down to each generation, and how this can last for 3 or 4 generations unless it's stopped. So that is why this is a really insightful conversation. I really enjoyed speaking with Mark. It was an amazing, amazing time where I learned so much. There were so many more questions I wanted to ask, and we do really go deep on the basics, on the beginning, so that you begin to understand, like, is this even a real thing? Is it proven by medical science? And the questions you can begin to ask yourself right away on this podcast to see if you have some level of inherited family trauma, which I believe that most of us do. So again, a really insightful conversation. Mark is a very, you can tell, compassionate, understanding individual, and I think you're really going to enjoy it. So enjoy the show and let us know what you thought.
Welcome to the Cabral Concept, where board-certified naturopath and integrative health practitioner Dr. Stephen Cabral shares how he was diagnosed at the age of 17 with a life-altering illness and given no hope for recovery. It was only after studying and traveling all over the world did he discover how to combine ancient Ayurvedic healing practices with state-of-the-art naturopathic and functional medicine to fully rebalance the body and re-energize it with life. It's time to discover how to get well, lose weight, and finally feel alive again. And now, here's your host, Dr. Stephen Cabral.
Mark Wolynn, it's a pleasure to have you on the show here today. Thank you for joining us.
Dr. Cabral, I'm happy to be here.
So I just got finished, and it was actually recommended by a few people reading your book, It Didn't Start With You: How Inherited Family Trauma Shapes Who We Are and How to End the Cycle. And just finding out as well, it's been now translated into 20 languages and was the 2016 winner of the Nautilus Award in Psychology. So obviously a lot of accolades behind this book. I'm sorry that it took 4 years for me to actually get to it, but it's amazing to have you on the show here today, and I can't wait to introduce your work to our community.
Great. I'm looking forward.
So the first thing I really want to start with is, what exactly is inherited family trauma? We'll get into how we recognize it in just a little bit, but what is this topic that is becoming so popular to really begin to dive deep on?
So let's say one of our parents or grandparents has a significant trauma. They lose their mother or their father when they're young. They're sent away to boarding school or placed in an orphanage. They have a birth trauma. One of their siblings dies tragically. Any event significant enough to break the heart of the family, rigidify the family. And what we find out is the reaction doesn't stop. The trauma reaction doesn't necessarily stop with the people who experience it. It can be passed on to children and grandchildren, and there's now lots of biological evidence for this.
How did you first discover this? What type of work were you looking into yourself that really gave you this type of insight?
You know, it's interesting. I discovered it quite by accident. I going back 25, 30 years ago, I was working with a lot of cutters, self-injurers. And this one particular woman, she would cut, I'll call her Sarah for the sake of the interview. She would cut so deeply into her arms or her legs or her abdomen that she would hit a major vessel and she would nearly bleed to death. And then her parents would have to rush her to the hospital to stop the bleeding. Then the hospital gets her, and now they place her in a psych ward for 3 weeks or a month at a time because they think she's trying to kill herself. And one day when Sarah's out of the hospital, I'm working with her and recognizing that she's cutting differently than the other cutters that I work with is more, they're cutting more superficially, and she's cutting in a way where she's almost bleeding to death. So I am doing what I knew to do at the time, look at the childhood. And actually her childhood was quite lovely. Look at her relationship with her parents. And it was great. She was able to receive love and nurturing from each parent. So I figured, okay, it has to be the attachment. So I started to ask questions about her birth and any birth trauma, and nothing, Dr. Cabral. She has a solid, safe, secure attachment with her mom. So I'm flummoxed. And luckily, I asked the right question. I said, tell me about your grandparents. And boom, she drops the bomb. She tells me that her dad's mother was an alcoholic, and she was driving the car drunk, and she crashes into a telephone pole with grandpa in the passenger seat. Grandma lives from the impact, but grandpa goes through the glass and gets cut, lacerated on the glass, and bleeds to death before the ambulance arrives. Now, what's interesting about this case is I one day have Sarah in my office, and before I even find out this history, I say, Sarah, here, I'm going to hand you a pen and pretend it's the knife, and put it to your arm like you're going to cut, and tell me, what's that feeling? What's that impulse? What happens right as you're about to cut? And she puts the pen here and she starts to glaze over, and I can see that she's starting to dissociate and disconnect. And I go, stop right there. What's happening right there? And she looks at me and she says, I don't deserve to live. Now, before I know the story about her grandmother and grandfather, it doesn't make any sense, because I'd said to her, Sarah, what did you do? Did you take somebody's life? Did you kill somebody? Did you break up with somebody who took his or her life? She said, no, nothing like that. Then she tells the story about the grandparents. And in that story, who felt they didn't deserve to live? Grandma, for taking someone's life, her beloved, her husband. So in this story, this one experience of cutting, bleeding out, and feeling like I don't deserve to live, she's telling the story of her grandparents. And in that moment, I knew what to do, because I was a student of psychodrama back then. I put out 2 chairs in the room and I said, Sarah, close your eyes, see your grandfather over there, and tell your grandfather what you do. Tell him. And she said, Grandpa, I cut myself. I go, tell him how deeply you cut. I cut so deeply, tell him I nearly bleed to death, that I nearly bleed to death. And then I said, add the words, like you, Grandpa, like you. And she's saying it, she's crying. And I go, what's he, with your eyes closed, what's he telling you? What's he showing you? And she's saying, he doesn't want me to do this. He's telling me when I go to do this, to feel him there with me, supporting me. Then I have her look at the other chair, at her grandmother. And I go, tell her what you told me. I don't deserve to live. Grandma, I don't deserve to live. Tell her that would be your feeling, Grandma. You would feel you didn't deserve to live for killing Grandpa. And she's crying. And she's the same thing. Grandma's saying, listen, when you go to cut, feel me there. So she has this image, this inner image, Dr. Cabral, of her grandmother and her grandfather with her, supporting her. When she goes to cut, she stops cutting, because it's a deeper, more resonant, more meaningful feeling state, really, which is one of support, comfort, that overpowers, in a sense, the desire to cut. But I don't stop there. I have her bring her father into the session, and I go, Sarah, sit over there, while her father I work with, because, that's where the trauma sets into motion. Dad can't grieve the horribleness of he was 12 when this happened, of his father's death, because of the terribleness of the blood, the bleeding out, the ambulance not arriving in time, and the rage toward his mother for taking his father's life, because she's an alcoholic. So the trauma lives in him unresolved and passes to his daughter. So I asked him, tell me about your mom, why she drank. And he tells me that she was given away at 3 to an orphanage. And I looked at him and said, of course she drinks. Of course. Without the support of her mother, without the inner stability of the attachment, the paucity of dopamine, of course she drinks. And he got it. And he was able to have compassion for the first time for the mother he hated, and was able to grieve the loss of his father. While Sarah's watching this on the couch, I'm working with him to open his heart to his father, his mother, and he's grieving this. And the coolest thing happens. He gets up at the end of the session, faces Sarah, and says, Sarah, you leave this with me. I've got this. And she never cut again.
That's, extremely powerful. That really is. And it's amazing the work yourself and other practitioners like this are able to do is make those connections. And for many people, it's not going to seem readily available to make the jump as to how what affected the grandmother and the father made its way to the daughter. And especially if it was not even talked about a lot of times in families. Inside of your book, you go through many, many scenarios where they didn't know the grandparents or whatever it might be. And I'd love to hear you explain. We talk a lot in our community about the nervous system, the central nervous system, and basically its connection with the brain as well. And sometimes there are no words for these things. They're kind of ingrained in our being and who we are and our actions. But you also mentioned Dr. Bruce Lipton's name and how some of this might actually be dictated before we're even born inside of our DNA. And I'd love for you to be able to explain that.
Oh, absolutely. This is the important stuff, really. Why is Sarah affected by what's unresolved in her father and a trauma 2 generations before? And, for that, we have to look at the science, because when a trauma happens to us, you and I know, and the scientific community knows, it changes us. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA, and this can change how our genes function, really for generations. Technically, a chemical tag will attach to our DNA, an epigenetic tag, and it will tell the cells to use or ignore certain genes, enabling us to better deal with this thing that just happened, this trauma. And then the way our genes are affected, this will change how we act or how we feel. For example, we can become sensitive or reactive to certain situations that are similar to the original trauma, even if that trauma occurred in a past generation, so that we have a better chance of healing it and surviving in this generation. I'll give you an example. If our grandparents come from a war-torn country, so there's bombs going off, there's bullets flying, there's uniformed men lining people up in the square, there's people being shot, people taken away, people triggered into their fear response. Grandma and grandpa will adapt, epigenetically adapt. A skill set, really. Let's say sharper reflexes, quicker reaction times, reactions to the violence, to help them survive, ultimately them, but it passes to us, to help us survive generations later, a trauma that they experienced. And the problem is that here we are inheriting a stress response to their trauma with the dials, set to 10. And here we are waiting for this catastrophe that never arrives, because we're not in a war-torn country. We're in the middle of the suburbs, but we hear a sound like a backfire of a car, and we're triggered into arousal. And we rarely make this link that our hypervigilance, our anxiety, our depression is connected to our parents and our grandparents. We just think we're wired this way. And then, these gene changes, this is what's passing forward to our children and our grandchildren. And you mentioned, Bruce Lipton, he talks about how the mother's emotions can be chemically communicated through the placenta, through the blood-borne barrier to the child, altering the genetic expression of our DNA. So it's not the DNA that changes, it's how the genes express. It's molecular changes and stress responses that we clinicians are dealing with. Stress responses, really.
And it does seem, when we look at our genetic code, only a part of that is able to be basically ascertained from our DNA, and the rest is what is considered junk DNA, as you quoted in your book, or at least DNA that we don't fully know about yet. And it does look like other things are able to be imprinted on that we take with us, just like we see water can be imprinted with certain frequencies. And that's a really interesting source of study right now. But one thing, if we bring it back to what we do know in scientific literatures, we know women that are cause higher levels of stress and cortisol during pregnancy oftentimes have lower birth weights. They have sometimes miscarriages. They have all these different things that would be associated with a higher fight or flight. And they have children more worried and et cetera as babies. So we know that these things absolutely hold true. What I want to know from your perspective as well is, well, how, because in your book, you say sometimes these things don't arise until a certain age. 18 years old, 19 years old. Is that because of the stories we heard when we were younger from our parents, or is it actually somewhere printed on our DNA to be triggered at a certain event or time?
I love the question. These are the things we can't really explain, but we see them. They're observable. They're phenomenologically observable, hundreds, thousands of times, where there seem to be these ancestral alarm clocks in our body, these triggers that show up at a particular age, let's say age 30, when our grandma became widowed and our parents, and so she never partnered again, and our parents split up. And here we are, 29, 30 years old, and all of a sudden we look at our partner and we say, she doesn't do it for me anymore, he doesn't do it for me anymore. Without thinking, there's this imprinting that's going on. So we can be born with an anxiety or a depression and never think to separate it from the events of the previous generation. That's true. However, like you said, all of a sudden, age 18, age 25, age whatever it is, we can experience a fear or a symptom that begins to emerge. It strikes suddenly or unexpectedly when we reach this certain age, or we hit a certain milestone or an event in our life. For example, as soon as we get married, everything's great. Life is going wonderfully. But now we hit this event called marriage, and all of a sudden we sink into a depression or an anxiety. In the book, I talk about this Lebanese or Iraqi woman, I forget, but she loves her husband. He's the right guy for her. But as soon as she's married, she feels trapped and she can't explain it. And she comes to do work with me because I don't get it. I love this guy, but I feel shut down and trapped. And when we looked in her family history, we saw that both of her grandmothers were married, given away as child brides to much older men. One of them was 9 and one of them was 12. And they're given away to these men 40 years old and lived these loveless marriages, trapped marriages. And so it's a good question you're asking, and I want to deepen this for a minute. But even if she didn't know this, even if this information wasn't known, what age grandma was given away, it would still track through and emerge. But what was interesting in this case is her older sister like the grandmothers, married a guy 30 years older. Her younger sister would never get in a relationship at all. She refused to ever be in relationship lest she be triggered. And what's interesting, this isn't the only trigger. These aren't the only triggers, age or getting married. Another one is we move to a new place. And so even if we move across town, even if we move a few blocks away, and suddenly we become depressed and we don't connect it, but maybe our ancestors were persecuted or killed or forced out of their homeland. And then all it took for us was this trigger of moving. And again, whether we knew about it, whether we had the information or not, the triggers stayed the same. As you said, there's some type of imprint, or we get rejected by our partner, Dr. Cabral. And even if we were only with this person, 2 months, and all of a sudden we go, oh, I don't want to live anymore. We don't realize that the rejection itself is triggering us to experiencing a much earlier grief that was insurmountable, perhaps a break in the attachment with our mom. Or we get rejected by a partner. Another dynamic is we go to have children. And, we're fine. Life is going along smoothly. And all of a sudden, we make someone pregnant or become pregnant. And then these fears or symptoms or anxieties begin to trigger because maybe grandpa impregnated grandma and she died in childbirth. Or I remember working with this one woman who she was consumed with anxiety. She had no clue as to what was going on. And we were trying to slow it down in the office. And I said, when did this anxiety first begin? And she said, I don't know, 7-8 months ago. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, that's when I got pregnant. And then I was able to ask those questions that I ask in the book. What's the worst thing that could happen were you to become pregnant? She said, I'll harm my baby. And of course, I asked her, had you ever harmed a baby? And she said, no. And I said, had anyone in the family ever harmed a baby? And she was about to say no. And she went, oh. And then she told the story of her grandmother who, lit a candle and the candle caught the curtains on fire, caught the house on fire, burned, and the baby's upstairs sleeping and she can't get the baby out. And the baby died. And then, of course, as you know what I'm about to say, the client says to me, but we were never allowed to talk about it. You never said anything to grandma about this baby. And what was interesting here is, again, when people don't talk about these traumas, when people don't do the healing, when these traumas remain unresolved in our family history, it creates a fertile ground for repetition and reliving. And at this point, I can work with her and we can work because she is carrying grandma's true experience of a trauma in her fears. And it wasn't her fear. Didn't belong to her. Like the book says, it didn't start with you. It was never her fear in the first place.
No, and a lot of times these aren't, you're feeling a certain way and you're having a difficult time rationalizing it because it's not rational, because you don't truly understand where it's coming from. But once you eventually make that connection, then you can say, oh, I get it. But the big thing is that, and you talk about this in your book, and I do want to say a lot of times when we look at, rat or mouse studies, they really are poignant and they do matter because the genetics inside of a mouse, I think it's like 98%. It's very, very close. And so the difference is, though, we can look at generations, correct me if I'm wrong, with mice experiments in about 12 weeks. Like we can look at those specifics. So we can see that we can run these experiments, taking a baby away from its mother at a certain age, what happens to that mouse, that rat in that particular experiment. Well, the thing is, it makes total sense because just like you said, if you're born in a war-torn society and you have something to fear, it is a benefit to you and the next generation to carry that on. The problem is with humans, we're looking at, I believe it's 3 to 4 generations that this trauma could affect and show up in an individual. One question I guess I had for you is, does it ever skip a generation? Like, could it move from the grandmother, not to the mother, and then to the grandchild?
Yeah, and I love what you're doing talking about mice because it's so significant. This is how we learn. And so the answer to that question is a simple, absolutely. It can skip our parents as our parents are tightened around the trauma, rigidified, functioning. Once the next generation happens and the next generation is looser in a sense, we're further away from the trauma. There's a little bit more freedom to feel, and we feel what our parents can't feel. So in answer to that question, our parents can be functioning and surviving in survival mode and doing everything that they need to do. And here we are expressing what they don't express, expressing what they can't express. But going back to these mice studies, because I love to talk about mice, you're absolutely right. 12 to 20 weeks, we can get a generation. And yeah, over 90% of the genes in humans and mice are similar. And one of the most replicated studies in all of epigenetics is separating baby mice from their mums and stressing the mums out, putting them in a glass jar or, taking the babies away, but not even for a long time. There's 4 lines in my book. I think I'm just going to say them because it's such a significant thing. And then I just wanted to follow up that thought. And yes, you can see the effects for 3 generations in these mice. So in the book I talk about, in one such studies, researchers, and I know this off by heart already because it's such an important passage. Research prevented females from nurturing their pups for up to, not long, for up to 3 hours a day for the first 2 weeks of life. That's it, Dr. Cabral. That's it. Just this little bit of time for up to 3 hours a day. Later in life, these pups, they started to exhibit behaviors similar to what we call depression in humans. What's crazier is the symptoms seemed to worsen as the mice aged. And then surprisingly, some of the male mice didn't express these behaviors themselves, but appeared to epigenetically transmit these behavioral changes to their female offspring, which is like fathers going off to war and coming back numb from the trauma, but their daughters carrying their father's fight or flight or freeze response, his shaking, his terror, his shutdown. And it's not just fathers and daughters. Inherited trauma is an equal opportunity employer. So male children and female children are equally impacted by a mother's or a father's trauma. There's new studies since my book was published that I love, and I want to speak them here. My book is very current and up to date, but I wish I had these 2 studies in that I'm about to mention. There's this recent study in the Journal of American Psychiatry, the JAMA Psychiatry, that follows mothers who suffer trauma as children and found that their daughters are more likely to struggle with depression and bipolar disorder. And then there's this recent Tufts, and these are on my Facebook page. Anything new is on my Facebook page. A recent Tufts University study found that men who suffered trauma as children are able to pass their anxiety through to their children through their sperm. And this is the first study, this is why it's significant, to show that the human sperm mirrored the same changes, the same non-coding RNA changes found in the mice that are traumatized as pups. And all they did was look at the men's ACE scores, their adverse childhood experience scores. And then they looked at sperm and then they matched it to the, here, let me go back into the science for a minute. RNA is copied from DNA and it acts as a messenger to instruct the cell's ribosomes to produce specific proteins. We know that. But cells also contain small non-coding RNA that don't produce proteins, that piggyback on the messenger RNA that interfering with or amplifying their function, causing more or less of proteins to be produced, causing more or less genes to be actively expressed. So one of the researchers that's doing some fascinating work right now is this Isabelle Monsuy out of the Brain Research Institute in Zurich. And I talk about her in my book. But recently what she's doing is she's looking at some of the blood samples of survivors from the 2015 Nice attack. You know, where that guy drives his van on the promenade and kills 80 people? So she's looking at the blood of the survivors, and she's finding correlations in the blood of her traumatized mice, as in these survivors, non-coding RNA.
Wow.
And she's also looking at the blood samples of Pakistani orphans from all the trauma there, their chaotic early years, similar to the mice that had been separated from their mothers in the lab. And she's finding, again, similar non-coding RNA alterations, basically similar biomarkers in mice and children, humans, mice and humans.
Yeah, I think that I really do believe, even though it's still difficult to, from a Westerner's logical scientific perspective, to say, how do we get it there? But we know it's there. We don't necessarily know all of the different, I think, mechanisms, but we do know that it is somehow being transferred. And also from a survival standpoint, it makes sense for every type of mammal or creature to be able to pass on what they learn somehow through memories and events to that next generation and generation after that for survival-based purposes. So that, to me, I get it. I would like to know, and just shift just a little bit, how were they created in the first place? You talk about 4 unconscious themes that typically create this trauma. And I believe you already named one with the separation. But you obviously, you wrote it. I would love to hear the 4 ways that you simplify this.
Thank you. I love that. So what I find is there are 4 ways that life force available to us, life experience gets limited. You know, our relationships, don't go well. The way we deal with money or career or success doesn't go well. Vitality, we find we're exhausted. Our health issues. And so as I've been looking at this, I go, what tips this off? What strikes? What creates the fertile ground for this reliving, for these repetitions? And I found 4 dynamics that sit at the core. One is we are unconsciously merged, repeating the life experience of our parent, the life situation of our parents without even realize we're doing so. Mom gives away her first child. Unconsciously, we abort our first child. Dad loses all the money at the racetrack at 40, and all of a sudden we hit the same age, 40, and we begin to make bad business decisions. Mom is ill and unwell, and we are ill and unwell. Mom's mistreated by dad, and a woman gets married and she's mistreated by her husband. And, why? What is going on? So I find this. 1, we're merged unconsciously with the life experience of a parent. Secondly, we reject a parent. Which is common. And unconsciously, what gets set up inside of us is reliving. And I'll share how that happens. Mm-hmm. If we reject a parent, unconsciously, we reject the behavior in that parent we don't like. For example, we disown what we don't like in them. We say, I will never be distant like she is, or I will never be abusive like he is. And then we disown that behavior in ourselves, and we can't see when we're the same. So unconsciously, that behavior expresses in us, and we can't see it when we're the same. We're abusive, we're distant. That's one way unconsciously it happens. The second way it happens is we unconsciously pull in a partner who treats us the same way. We pull in a partner who's abusive or cold, Or we pull in a really nice partner, but because we're hyper vigilant and waiting for that partner to be abusive, they become abusive because they see we don't trust them. So they breed this in our field in because we don't trust them and we're waiting for them to be a bad guy or a bad gal or whatever. They do. Or we pull in somebody who treats us this way, so we have an opportunity to heal this trauma of being abused or having somebody be cold to us. Thirdly, and I like this one the best because it's the most insidious, if our parent ignored us, we ignore the child part inside us. We ignore that young self inside us. If our parent was critical, we become self-critical. If our parent was aggressive, we become inwardly aggressive, doing to ourselves what we believe they did to us. So we've got reject a parent as a dynamic. We've got merged with a parent as a dynamic. I already talked about this, but a break in the attachment with our mother will create a reliving and being identified, like Sarah, with someone other than the parents, identified with a grandparent, a stillborn brother, an aunt, an uncle, creates these relivings. So that's the short version. The longer version is in the book, and What We Do, How We Heal is in the book, which I'm happy to talk about here too. But that's the short version of the 4 unconscious themes.
Yeah, and for me, I just believe that most people have a degree of this. That's not like anyone gets left out. Some people have more inherited trauma than others. But I just look at, how many people do you know that their siblings were born within 2 years or 3 years of each other? And that's such an important time in a child's development. You're not really remembering too much before the age of 5 or 6. You don't know that when that brother or sister or sibling came along and you got less attention, well, that's almost somewhat natural because your mother now has another baby that she has to tend to for life, but you don't necessarily see it that way because you're an 18-month-old or a 12-month-old. And so I think these things are important to explore because they most likely have happened to some degree to us. And it's now playing out in a lot of the different, I would say, non-rational behaviors that we partake in or the things that repeat themselves. So before I really knew about this work, and I still believe they're connected, I always referred to it as the subconscious mind. So essentially, we are on autopilot for the most part, 95% of our life, with the thoughts that we think, the feelings that we feel, and the actions that we take. And the actions that we take just reinforce the thoughts that we have, and the thoughts we have reinforce our feelings, and so on and so forth. And I believe there is truth to that because of what we've seen and the different programming before the age of 8, as Dr. Lipton speaks about as well. But there's one more level to this now. It's almost like a subconscious programming before we were even born. And when we can begin to explore that, well, we have levels to work on where we always think that, okay, we've worked on this. There might be that one more thing that we need to begin to work on. And if you could expand on that, but also start to share some of the questions that we can maybe begin to ask to identify, is there something going on? Like, is there a question that we can ask ourselves to say, oh, I guess there is something. Maybe I don't know yet. And yes, so your book, I consider, yes, it's a book, but it's really a workbook. And that's why I like it, that it's, because not every person's going to be able to work or find the person that they need to do this work, but they can work this book, not overnight, but they can begin to work it and answer the questions and get a lot of the help that they need. But what are some of those questions to say, okay, there is something there. Let me begin to explore this.
Great. So it's a multifaceted question. Let me go back to what you said earlier that's so important, and you're so spot on. We have got to explore the landscape before we have conscious memory. So what happened? So when these questions are right on my website, actually, markwolynn.com. They're right there. But let me just talk about some of these early trauma in this generation, us experiences, were when we were during conception. Did our parents get along? Was our dad drinking? Was someone cheating? Were they separating? Were they fighting? Were there any events in utero? Did our mom's brother die? Did her father die? Did she almost eject the fetus? Did she have to lay in bed for the last trimester? Was dad cheating? during the labor, during the delivery? Was it a long labor? Was it a difficult delivery? Did they use forceps? Were we crushed against the pelvic floor? Once we're taken out, were there any medical issues? Were we in the incubator? Were we separated from our mom for any reason? The questions go on and on and on to begin to look at this landscape. During our first months of life, during our first years of life, did mom and dad take a vacation? Did she send us to grandma's? Were our parents separated? Did we go back and forth to our moms and our dads too early? There are so many questions, Dr. Cabral, that we've got to answer here to begin to see, like you said, these irrational behaviors that begin to poke through. So those are some questions. Then in the book, I also have these types of inherited trauma questions. For example, one of my favorite ones is, what's your worst fear? If the worst thing happened to you, if things went suddenly wrong, terribly wrong, if things suddenly fell apart, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? And when we answer that question, we begin to see two types of answers. One is generational, and one is attachment. So if it's an attachment direction, we begin to see, I'll be alone, I'll be abandoned, I'll be left, I'll be rejected. And we now know that it isn't even necessarily our attachment, because we have to look at our mother's attachment with her mother, our father's attachment with his mother, theirs with their mothers, great grandma, grandmas, mothers with grandmas, grandmas with great grandmas, grandpas with great, and so on, and ours with our mother. So this attachment language begins to filter into our reality, where we walk around all the time with fears that we'll be left and abandoned, and we don't do well in relationships, and we tighten during intimacy, or we disconnect from our partner, the first sign that our partner isn't playing ball. And then there's this generational language, Dr. Cabral. I'll hurt somebody. I'll do something terrible. Like Sarah's, I won't deserve to live. I'll deserve to die. I'll go crazy. I'll be locked up. I'll lose my family. I'll be sent away. I'll be ostracized. I'll be hated. Everyone will hate me. And this is generational language. And what's so beautiful, I take people in the book through what I call the core language map, and I gather their trauma language, and then I have them draw write this sentence out on top of their traumagram, and look for the traumas in the family history where someone had cause to feel the same way. You're right; it is a workbook, and I have people. In the first part of the book, I teach them how to become. I give the science. And I teach them how to be detectives of this trauma language, both verbal and nonverbal. And then in the second part of the book, I teach them how to make the link. And then in the third part of the book, I teach them how to heal, how to begin to use inner images and healing sentences, and making certain movements in their lives that allow the brain to calm, the brain to change, the stress response, the limbic brain to downregulate.
Yeah, and I think you do a really clean job at saying these are the core complaints, these are the core descriptors, these are the core sentences, and this is the core trauma. So it's basically saying we have to keep distilling until we figure it out what it is. And in a practice, although not exactly similar to yours, we're always looking for the underlying root cause. So we always say, whether it's an autoimmune issue, a gut issue, like there's only so many different things that it could be. And it seems in your book as well, although there's a myriad of issues that may have happened in the past, there's really, it seems, only so many feelings that a person will feel that are related to a specific trauma. And you're able to continue to distill that. I think sometimes, and I would like you to speak on this, it may be challenging if you're not able to ask a parent about their life growing up. Or so maybe your parents are alive, but they're just not communicators. They're just not people that are going to open up to you. It's just it's beyond what they're willing to do. You might be able to, but they're just not, because they're shelled up, as you spoke about. And so then it's like, well, how do we find out about the parents and the grandparents, and maybe you were adopted? And I know that you have a way to be able to say you can still heal, even if you're not able to mend a relationship with a parent or grandparent.
Absolutely. So, again, multifaceted question. I want to answer both parts of it. The first part, there are questions. Let's say our symptom shows up. Let's say all of a sudden we're working with migraines or irritable bowel syndrome or chronic fatigue. What we're doing is trying to ask, the 12 questions of the core complaint in that chapter that I have, where what happened right before the symptoms appeared? What was going on in your life? What triggered this migraine? When you get migraines, what happened? What happens right before it? What was the first age? What happens in its worst moment? All those questions that I have that allow us to separate out symptoms, because symptoms are talking to us. They're speaking to us. And, we look at symptoms in Western culture a lot as bad. I know you don't, but a lot of times people look at them as bad instead of as messengers helping us heal, right? The symptoms are coming around to say, hey, listen to me. I'm talking to you. I'm speaking to you. And I want to help you unravel the puzzle so we can begin to heal. And the second part of your question, what happens when there's no information? And it's a great question, because the information's there. Even if our parents are deceased, they don't talk, we're adopted. This information lives in our trauma language, both verbal and nonverbal. So a minute ago, I gave you an example of the verbal trauma language: attachment, I'll be abandoned, I'll be rejected. And now I want to give you an example of nonverbal. So nonverbal trauma language are our fears, our unexplained symptoms, when they appeared, how they appeared, what happened right before. This nonverbal language trail, it's also in our self-destructive behaviors. When we drink, when we smoke, when we do drugs, when we when we eat everything in the refrigerator, when we, start to sink into our depression. It's in our self-sabotaging behaviors, what we do in relationships, this whole language that we need to follow. It lives in the symptoms of an illness that appear after an unsettling event, or that happened at a certain age, right? I want to know what age you were when those migraines happened and at first appeared, and what was going on with someone else in the family at that age, or what was going on with you right before, et cetera, et cetera. It's in our relationship struggles, who we choose, the types of partners we choose, the repeated ways we deal with money or success. All of this, Dr. Cabral, forms a breadcrumb trail that we've got to follow. And this gives us the information. Even if we don't know what happened in our family history, this stuff tells us what happened in our family history. Even if it's been lost or kept secret, or our parents just didn't tell us, or we're adopted.
It makes a lot of sense. And I usually talk about 5 big areas of life that we can typically put in our buckets: our family and relationships, our career or work, our health, our spirituality, and our body. And what I say is, a lot of times people are doing really well in 4 of those, and they start to do well in the other one, whatever that 5th one is. They get to a certain point, and that seems to be their thermostat. They're stuck there, or they do move outside of that thermostat, and then it just pulls them right back down to whatever that comfort level is for them. And besides the subconscious feelings that we have inside of us, that could also be tied to then some inherited based trauma. And I think that's where self-sabotage, or just upper limits, like look at those upper limits, look at the self-sabotage, and that might be a good first place to start.
Brilliant. Well said. Yeah.
So if we're able to figure that out, and I think if people do that self-reflection and journaling, and I know you're big on journaling, writing things down, we always try to remember everything. You need to put that pen to paper. I'm a big advocate of that. And this is a book that you can mark up. I mean, it's your copy, buy a copy for someone else. Don't lend this one out, keep it for yourself and use it as a workbook. But so let's say we were able to start to pin things down. I mean, is there hope for healing for everyone? What does that look like?
So, I've only given the bad news that we're all in the same boat and it's sinking.
Yes.
But it's not true. It's not true at all. The big research out there right now is researchers are able to reverse trauma symptoms in mice. And the implications of this are vast. Remember in the book I talked about those mice that were made to fear the cherry blossom scent? And they were shocked every time. And then you could see the epigenetic effect for 3 generations. Those same mice, the researcher Brian Diaz, he taught them how not to fear the scent, because he repeatedly began to expose them to the stimuli, which before had been, I'm going to be shocked. And then they were no longer had the heightened sensitivity to the scent. And the cool thing is their sperm lost the fearful epigenetic signature that was passing into the future generations. And then remember Isabelle Monsuy, I talked about her in the book, and she's placing these mice, separating from their mums. Well, now she begins to put them in positive, low stress environments. And I talk about this in the book. And their trauma symptoms reversed. Their behaviors improved, and then there were changes in DNA methylation, which is one of the mechanisms. One of the mechanisms, and this this DNA methylation, histone modifications, non-coding RNA, all these mechanisms for this transfer. And this prevented the symptoms from being transmitted to the next generation. And then there's brand new research from Australia that when we recover from PTSD, we can have now physiologic responses in the body, resilience, post-traumatic growth, they now call it. And this is exciting news. So it's not just mice that benefit from positive experiences, it's people. Because mice and people, as you said, genetically we're very similar. So to heal, you and I, people, we've got to have positive experiences that can change our brain. And then we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations associated with these positive experiences. And then when we do this, we not only create new neural pathways, we also begin to stimulate the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain that we need: serotonin, GABA, dopamine. We also begin to stimulate the release of feel-good hormones that our body needs, like estrogen, oxytocin. And most importantly, the very genes involved in the body's stress response can begin to alter, they can begin to function in a improved way. We can change the way our DNA expresses, is what I'm really saying. And then these positive experiences, what are they? Well, remember Sarah, who I talked about with the cutter? Not her real name. She was able to use an experience of comfort and support from her grandparents. And this changes the brain. But there's other feelings, like feelings of compassion, gratitude, a practice of gratitude, a practice of generosity, doing something every day, generous for somebody, a practice of loving kindness, breathing out, loving kindness, a practice, mindfulness. Of course, these are all forms of mindfulness, but ultimately anything that allows us to feel strength or peace or joy inside, or curiosity or wonder or awe, because these types of experiences feed the prefrontal cortex and allow us to pull energy away from the trauma brain, the limbic brain, the amygdala, and help us reframe the stress response, which is the important thing. So it has a chance to calm down, so we can downregulate. So we can integrate these new experiences and our brains can change. You and I know, and I talk about this in the book, that for mindfulness, our brain changes. Our amygdala shrinks, our prefrontal cortex thickens. Basically, to put it in a nutshell, we've got to practice being with what's positive and what's positive in our body, the sensations that are positive. Go beneath the terrible, intolerable, painful, fearful sensations until we can reach what's beneath them. Sensations like that we experience as life-giving, like pulsing, 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 heart beating, blood flowing, tingling, my body softening. There's an expansion in my solar plexus. I can feel my blood, just pulsing out to the rest of my body. I can feel waves of energy or waves of warmth. Well, we need to be able to be with these deeper sensations and hold them for a minute, 6 times a day. Literally staying with pulsing, pulsing, pulsing for a minute, 6 times a day is enough to change our brain and calm our stress response.
Oh, it's amazing. And it really, one of my first, I would say, mentors, even though I never obviously got to meet him, was Hans Seeley. And he was essentially one of those people that coined fight or flight in the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, but it really healing for the physical body and the mind. And we're talking about a mind, body, nervous system based connection as well, really goes back to a feeling of that you're going like that it's going to be okay and moving into the parasympathetic nervous system. And a couple of things that I really picked up is maybe you can't change the people around you and your upbringing and your parents' upbringing, but you can have understanding and you can have compassion. And that sometimes can be enough. And that's a great way to begin to view, because we don't always know. Like, we can look at our parents in a certain way, but we never lived in their shoes. We don't know exactly what happened to them. And then they're doing this to us, but typically unconsciously. I don't know that a lot of parents are consciously creating abandonment issues and inherited trauma with their children. Some, of course, are, yes, but for the most part, parents are doing the best they can. And that's it. I mean, they're not perfect. And so I think this is a really nice way to begin to look at it. And I'm optimistic as well, because I see in my practice more and more methylation issues every single year. And I wonder, well, I know there was always stress, but is it compounding? I know it's toxicity in the environment, but it's really great to hear, because I know that we can turn it off right now through epigenetics, but it's great to hear that our inherited trauma, even if it's only 1 generation removed, so it could last for another 2, it could stop with us if we're willing to do the work. So if not for us, maybe for our children. I think that's a really great way to look at it as well.
Oh, absolutely. You said so much in that question. And, let me just say one thing, yes, when we begin to peel back the layers of what happened, look behind the curtain of what happened to our mom, what made her distant, what made our father drink, we can begin to have compassion. And compassion itself, first we get to understanding, very deep sentence. I understand. I get it. Mom, I get it. Dad, I get it. Of course you hit with a belt. Or Mom, of course you couldn't feel those things. Or when you saw them in me, Mom, of course they made you look at your own child inside that you ignored. And, so what happens is we begin to get to understanding, which turns into compassion, which is one of those feeling states, those states we talked about, that allows us to change our brain. So yes, and yes, and yes.
This has been amazing. I want to talk with you for another hour, but the truth is that the details I want to ask go much, much deeper. I need people to read this book for sure. So many people in our community are learning about their digestive issues, their mitochondrial issues, their nervous system-based issues. But I think that this is another part to that equation. And so I can't recommend Mark Wolynn's book enough. It didn't start with you. And Mark, how else can we connect with you on social media, your website as well?
All the platforms, all the studies. So my book has them all in there, and there's a couple that have been added since then. They're right on my Facebook page. That'd be a good place to start. Facebook.com/Mark Wolynn. My website, Mark Wolynn, WOLYNN.com. And then, of course, everywhere: Twitter, Instagram, every place. Yeah.
Excellent. Any parting words of advice? I want to make sure that you were able to expand upon anything that we may have missed that you think is really important for our audience before I send people off to learn more about you.
Dr. Cabral, I loved our talk. I thought we hit on all the important things. Your questions were fabulous. I would just add one final thing. Work on our own traumas. Work on them. But don't stay tight-lipped about the traumas in the family history. Let your children know the things that happened so they can understand what's going on inside them. So the more we explore the past, the more we don't have to repeat it, the more we can end these cycles. We can end this trauma. We can break the cycle.
And that's fantastic. Great words of advice. And I want to just one line that I picked up that I do want to repeat is, we feel what our parents can't feel. And so that was just a great line. It's one of those things where I know a lot of people in my practice on a personal level feel that disconnection. And so this might be the reason why. And so this is something absolutely worth exploring. Thank you again. Appreciate you having you on. And I look forward to our community connecting with you in the future on social and your website.
Beautiful. Loved our talk.
Ever wonder what the best sauna, blue blockers, sleep trackers, wake lights, salt lamps, or other health gadgets are? Or what about the top non-toxic mattresses, sheets, soaps, bath products, toothpaste, and cookware? Or would you like to know the cleanest choices for hemp parts, meal delivery services, supplements, and much more? I personally curated, researched, and now created a resource page of all of my top picks that continues to grow each week. These are the exact products I use in my own life, with my family, in my private practice, and they're the ones I trust. To find out all of my up-to-date recommendations and all the details, simply head on over to stephencabral.com/resources.